One claims it's the company's only chance for survival.
Atari has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The 31-year-old
AWA presents the difference. Kodak is filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection.
What's up, guys? My name is Jake, and welcome to the 31st episode of Bankrupt. Spirit Airlines started as a humble and small operation in the early 1990s. But in a rather short amount of time, they became the leading ultra-low-cost carrier in the United States, and a favorite of Wall Street with soaring growth and revenue. Eventually, their name and branding became widely known. But that notability also came with infamy. And post-pandemic, their business strategy began to drag the company further and further into debt, until they would ultimately declare bankruptcy. So today, let's take a look at the soaring highs and eventual lows of Spirit Airlines. The company started in the latter half of the 20th century, not in the air, but on the ground as a trucking company. It was founded by Michigan-born Ned Homfeld. At the time, his delivery service, focused on delivering automotive parts for companies in Cleveland and Detroit, was doing quite well. Ned would later invest in a small air charter company, which would later be renamed to Charter One in 1983. The company operated a small fleet of turboprop Convair CV-580s, and began flying tour packages for domestic tourists going to gambling destinations like Atlantic City. The charter service proved to be quite successful, and they continued to expand through the late 1980s. The company, under Homfeld's tight-knit corporate leadership, would ultimately seek out expansion into regular passenger service. By 1990, they would earn their commercial certificate, and by 1992, they would acquire two 120-seat DC-9 jet aircraft, likely at a pretty good discount due to their age. They would also change their name to Spirit Airlines. They would put these new aircraft into regular service, still focusing on Atlantic City and other leisure destinations, continuing with what they knew worked, which was essentially bringing people to go gamble. They did so at very competitive prices, offering one-way fares as low as $80, which was far lower than any US airline. Obviously, the onboard experience reflected that price, as everything was very bare bones. This very competitive price fare, along with the mentality that they must fill every seat on board each aircraft, gave them a very aggressive value play in the marketplace. And already, the small airline was doing quite well. By 1994, Spirit Airlines had carried more than 680,000 passengers with over $56 million in revenue, a massive increase from just the year prior. Spirit found themselves in an interesting place in the commercial aviation industry. The 90s were a time of high fuel prices, inflation, and fears spawned from the Persian Gulf War. It was a time when consumers were tightening up on their spending, and the major airlines in the country were subsequently bleeding. In fact, several massive companies like Pan Am, Eastern Airlines, and TWA would all declare bankruptcy or dissolve altogether. Now, this might have been pretty terrible all around, but this also meant that there was now a surplus of cheap equipment and labor flooding the market, and Spirit Airlines, with a desire to continue their growth, took full advantage. As a result, the airline would expand, and with consumers looking to save money, well, Spirit offered them cheap flights. Following a rebrand after the 1996 value jet crash and subsequent distrust in budget carriers, Spirit continued to see year-over-year sales and passenger numbers increase. By the end of the 90s, Spirit's rise was looking more and more like a surefire success story. With the new MD-80 aircraft, a rise in overall seats and employees, plus a headquarters move to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the airline was seeing record growth. By the dawn of the new century, Spirit Airlines had now become one of the largest budget airlines in the skies, and with a focus on leisure travel, they captured huge chunks of market share. Clearly, the company had overcome many challenges through the 90s, and came out the other side as a very attractive company, but still a rather small one. Spirit only employed around 2,700 people, and with their fleet of 32 aircraft, they only reached 16 domestic destinations and 1 international. With around 120 daily flights, they paled in comparison to the US giants like American Airlines with their thousands of daily flights. Regardless, Spirit was still growing, and by this point, Ned Homfeld had stepped down from CEO, handing it over to Jacob Skor, an internal investor who bought controlling shares of the company. But his ownership would be short-lived, as private equity were now looking to enter the airline business. In 2004, Oak Tree Capital Management would make a $125 million investment into the business, acquiring controlling shares. Their first move was to modernize the fleet. In March, they would place a $2 billion order with Airbus for 35 A319s and A321s. As these new aircraft began entering the fleet and the size of their destinations increased, yet another corporate owner would take hold. Indigo Partners LLC would then invest in the company, themselves taking controlling interest, just as Spirit had crossed the $500 million mark in net revenue. While the company did lose some money in 2006, mainly due to their fleet modernization, financials were trending positive. By the following year, the airline would introduce a rebranding campaign to go along with a revised business strategy. Their logo became more simplified, while their very 2007 brand new liveries were being introduced. Their new strategy was to adopt what was known as the ultra low-cost carrier model. Very simply, it meant that the airline would start offering extremely low fares, but make every other part of the experience an add-on fee. The company promised to cut fares by up to 40%, just as they began charging passengers for everything else, from baggage and seat selection to onboard food and beverage. Public sentiment, however, was also beginning to turn. Passengers often experienced canceled flights and poor customer service, a clear trend for many which would then be discussed online. The rapid growth of the airline was clearly hindering their customer experience, but also their employees, as pilots then took to the streets in protest of the poor wages they were making. To make matters worse for the airline, 2008 saw high fuel prices and decreased consumer spending in the leisure markets. Spirit Airlines was hit pretty hard by this economic turndown, and as a result, laid off hundreds of employees. Pilots in the company were still left with low wages, among some of the lowest paid in the industry. They would ultimately go on strike in 2010, grounding most flights, though a deal would be reached a few days later. Still though, the company was making money, and following the recession, they would start to see year-over-year growth, eventually crossing the $1 billion mark in revenue by 2011. That would be the same year in which the company would go public on the stock market, and right off the bat, it was a hot stock. Investors saw great potential with the brand, as the outlook for Spirit was looking very bright. Wall Street jumped on the hype, shooting their stock from an IPO of $12 a share to over $84 a share by 2014, a 630% increase from its start. Because of their low-cost fares and the many ways to charge passengers, the company was pretty lean from the commercial airline industry. Their operating costs per available seat mile, which is essentially how much the company spends per seat to operate, was an impressive 9.65 cents. This was while the major US carriers, like American Airlines, were nearly at 16 cents. Spirit had also now grown their route network to over 150 markets, with a fleet of 65 all-Airbus aircraft. Their entire fleet was made up of aircraft from the A320 family, allowing them to streamline maintenance and operations. Revenue had nearly crossed the $2 billion mark by this point, with hundreds of millions in net income. Again, very impressive for a budget airline. Really impressive for any airline. Spirit had also introduced a bold new livery around this time, with a clean black logo on an all-yellow livery. It would now almost be impossible not to notice a Spirit Airlines jet at the airport. The company would be spearheading the overall rise in budget air travel through this time, right alongside other budget competitors like Frontier, Southwest, and Allegiant, though Spirit was arguably the most notable brand of them all. Through the rest of the decade, the airline would see growth in its fleet and passenger numbers, now operating more than 500 flights per day. This wasn't without competition, however. Starting in 2015, all three major US airlines introduced some form of their own basic fare, which essentially followed in Spirit's footsteps with cheaper base prices and leaving everything else as an optional add-on. Since Spirit had a pretty damaged reputation from a consumer standpoint, the legacy airlines were just a simply more enjoyable experience. And with those base fares slightly narrowing, many passengers would ditch Spirit in favor of them. This damaged the company's overall profits, leaving growth in their net income rather stagnant. While 2019 was a good year for them, nearing the $4 billion mark in revenue with a positive outlook in their income and stock price, the airline was now looking down the barrel of yet another tumultuous decade. 2020 brought a screeching halt to operations for airlines. The massive drop in air travel due to the COVID-19 pandemic left many struggling to keep afloat. The major US airlines pivoted to focus more on leisure travelers, thus once again eating away at Spirit's main consumer base. The company would lose over $400 million that year, and would end up taking a massive $330 million loan from the government to ensure they had enough liquid cash to stay afloat. That paired with their 2019 order of 100 new Airbus A320neo family aircraft, well, it just added a ton of liabilities to their balance sheet. In fact, by 2022, Spirit Airlines had amounted a colossal $3.2 billion in long-term debt. This was in stark contrast to their financial condition in 2014, when they had just a mere $130 million in debt. Clearly, the airline was in trouble, and other brands saw blood in the water. Frontier Airlines, a rival ultra-low-cost carrier, had then formally offered to acquire Spirit for $2.9 billion in cash and stock. While this deal seemed to be in progress, JetBlue had also put up their own sudden offer of $3.6 billion. While Spirit's management seemed to have preferred a Frontier acquisition, their offer would ultimately fall through, and a deal with JetBlue would ultimately be reached. That is, until it was blocked by a judge over antitrust issues in 2023. Meanwhile, Spirit was having to deal with a high debt load, a poor brand perception, and now engine trouble, with many of their Airbus aircraft equipped with Pratt & Whitney engines. While the engine manufacturer would compensate for their losses, it still meant that aircraft had to be taken out of service, disrupting operations fleet-wide. Their margins would also take a hit, as jet fuel prices had increased significantly in 2022, severely diminishing their overall profit margins, which isn't great for an airline whose sole business model is based around ultra-cheap fares. The company was forced to sell off some of their aircraft and leased back to them, just to free up some cash to help deal with the ongoing situation. And despite management handling it pretty well, their stock price continued to tumble as year after year losses continued to pile up. Since 2020, Spirit had failed to turn a profit, with 2024 being their worst financial year on record, as the company would post $1.2 billion in net losses, with another $1 billion in looming debt payments coming up in the years ahead. Spirit just didn't have enough cash to pay it off. On Monday, November 18th, 2024, Spirit Airlines filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, just as their stock price had dropped to 15 cents a share. Since their high in 2014, in just 10 years, Spirit Airlines stock would lose nearly all of its value. The whole disaster for Spirit didn't entirely come out of nowhere though, as really the market and consumer priorities had shifted quite dramatically. By 2024, Spirit and basically all other budget airlines' operating costs per available seat mile had flipped from where they were just a decade ago, as now the legacy carriers were outperforming them in revenue. Following the pandemic, consumers were often willing to pay a little more for a better experience, and budget carriers like JetBlue and Frontier took note, both implementing new business plans to try and recapture those same passengers who were now flying with the legacy carriers. And as operational issues and cancellations plagued the airline, it all added to the extra costs, but also the negative consumer sentiment. The fact is that the world in which it was economically viable and even lucrative to operate an ultra-low-cost carrier is now gone. And this change certainly wasn't only affecting Spirit. All of the North American budget carriers were feeling the market shifts, and suffering as a result. The truth is, it doesn't seem like the ultra-low-cost carrier model is resilient enough for industry-wide changes. But Spirit was the first, and at this point, the only one to fall, though they were planning to get back up. Spirit Airlines went into their bankruptcy filings with the intention to exit as a leaner, restructured operation, working through their debt obligations and securing cash to keep their operations running normal. Through this time, Frontier would once again make a bid to acquire the company, now offering around $2.16 billion, though this would be rejected. Executives did leave the door open for further negotiations, though. Eventually, by March of 2025, the company would successfully restructure and exit bankruptcy. Now as a private company, since its public stock had been delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. In their exit, the company announced a change to their business model, now gearing their focus away from ultra low-cost fares and transitioning into a more mainstream style carrier, targeting more affluent travelers. The company promised to redesign its loyalty program to better compete with the legacy airlines, and even enter into a possible airline alliance. All of these changes are on the horizon currently, and have yet to take flight. Though you do have to ask yourself how realistic it is to completely change their entire brand image and make themselves competitive in a very cutthroat industry. It's possible that the likely outcome here will be one that ends up with a merger or a much smaller airline. When you look back at it all, boy has this company just been beaten down time and time again, especially following the pandemic. They really just haven't been able to catch a break, and that's perhaps mainly because the very structure of the company is based around a business strategy that just doesn't really work anymore. The market began to shrink following the pandemic as consumer priorities shifted, and that compounded with high debt loads, supply chain constraints, operational issues, and so much more, well, it just left the company struggling to stay in the skies. While they may be a pretty easy punchline for jokes, their downfall isn't that great for consumers. Love them or hate them, Spirit provided much needed competition, very aggressive competition, and the ultra low cost carrier model does benefit those who can't afford a regular flight on Delta or United. They certainly served a purpose, and their existence only made the marketplace better for consumers. So while they ultimately did emerge from bankruptcy, still as an intact corporate entity, they have a lot of work ahead of them to turn their pioneering low-cost model into one that, once again, makes money. If you like this video and want to support my work further, I do have a Patreon where you can subscribe for as little as a few dollars a month, and will get you additional perks like your name at the end of each video and much more. All of the money from that is going directly to help fund my next big project, which I have announced there, but haven't here yet. And I'll let you all know about it when we're a little closer to having it finished. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.